Hey guys, hope you're all doing okay. Welcome to the complete tutorial of CITRA, the 3ds emulator. This is a detailed video with timestamps included. I do recommend watching the whole video if you want to understand this emulator in depth. So without further ado, let's get started. First up, CITRA did not provide a full set of required specifications, and they only say that it requires OpenGL 3.3 minimum and really robust single core speed. So if you have an overclockable Intel CPU, that's awesome. It can work on integrated graphics, but they are not recommended as they are at only a fraction of the power of any dedicated graphics, and yes, even the newer architecture. 3ds was an attempt to make a 3D console with extremely immersive graphics, 3D effects, and some amazing titles. However, it did not work out that way at all. The 3D effects, while in some cases were absolutely brilliant, they were lackluster in other titles. The hardware of 3ds is not that powerful, but it's not a slouch either. It does not require significant specifications. However, if you want the utmost fluidity and smoothness, it's not a bad idea to have a competent build. The emulation project has been going on since 2013, and back then it was just a proof of concept. Now it has come a long way. For the most part, it still depends on the single core performance of your CPU. Given the architectural limits, emulating on a single core is way simpler because figuring out the connection, the synchronization of multi-core is very time consuming and tricky to implement. But it's not to say that this emulator does not utilize the cores available to it, it's just that it prefers single core operation. With that being said, let's download the emulator. Now, as you know, there are two versions of this emulator, as like most of the emulators out there. One is the stable release, which is the compatible release. The second one is the Canary Build, which is the experimental build, and they experiment with different features and stuff in that build. Now we're gonna install both of them because they're both important. Nightly build is the way to go for majority of the scenarios. However, the Canary build can include some bug fixes and performance optimizations. So if you get lower performance than anticipated, then please just try the Canary version. It's worth a shot. So to download that, just write cmu download CITRA download. Been making way too many of these guides lately. Yep, and citramu.org, that's the official website, and download for Windows x64. There are other platforms planned, but for now I think Windows is the perfect platform. And if you click on other platform, then we have Mac and Linux. If you use any of those, then you know what to do. But if you click on here, it's gonna download an exe file, which is gonna be 18 megabytes in size, and I already have it here. So we're just gonna double click that and try to install it. So it says welcome to the CITRA setup wizard. If you go to settings, it says proxy and repositories. It's gonna download some repositories. That's perfectly normal. But if you want to adjust some proxy settings, I don't know why you would, but it's there. You're just gonna click next, and then it's preparing some meta information and then retrieving some download repositories. Yep, that's where I want it to be. Now this is the important part. We want both of them to be installed, and we accept the license. And yes, next. So this is pretty self-explanatory, and it shouldn't take that long. But if you have a competent internet connection, mine is pretty slow, so depends on your internet connection. Then it's gonna download and install our repositories. Now I was talking about the CITRA Nightly Build and Canary Build. Nightly Build is the stable release, which means that a lot of testers and implementers have tested the builds for different bugs and different implementations, and then they put out that release for the public. But Canary Build is the same thing, but they have not approved the changes yet. But that does not mean that it's not going to give you performance. It's just that they haven't done that much testing and they haven't gone through that process of approval. So that's why there are two versions of CITRA, and Canary builds can include performance optimizations. So it's a worth shot. So we're gonna launch CITRA Nightly Build for sake of simplicity, and then we have the UI right here. It's always a good idea to install redistributable C++ from 2010 to 2019, both x86 and x64 versions. Then you won't get a runtime error. If you might get an error, then that's the way to go. Just install those redistributables. Your DirectX should be up to date, and then you shouldn't get any errors. If you get an OpenGL error, that means that your specifications are way too low to run this emulator. But I think these days everyone has minimum of OpenGL 3.3, so it's a very low standard, and I think even the low-end PCs have that. So if you go to load file, here we can load file and install CIA. It's not the agency, it's just the extension of the file. So if you dump your cartridge and then you want to install a specific application or game, you can install it from here, or you can just load a pre-installed file or pre-extracted files from here. Amiibo is the agent that we're not going to go into. Open CITRA folder if you want to open that folder. It's pretty self-explanatory. Now we haven't got any game running, so that's why these are all grayed out. But if you have a game running, you can do all these different functions. And in report compatibility, if you want to report the compatibility of a certain game and you come across some bugs and you see in the list that it's listed as playable, but even if your PC is competent, it's not playable, then you can report the compatibility. And in configure we have all these options, which we're going to go into in just a second. And then in view we have full screen, pretty self-explanatory, single window mode, screen layout, what kind of layout do you want, dock widgets, debugging, and these are all our debugging options, and we're not going to do any debugging. And multiplayer is pretty self-explanatory. If you want to create a room, for me, I think the games that I like to play, there haven't been that many room or that many online lobbies, so I couldn't play multiplayer. But you might have better luck than me playing different games, and maybe you're in a different region, so it's always worth a shot. And in tools we have movie if you want to record movie or play movie. So if you want to record your gameplay, that's up to you. Frame advance, I think it's a technique for performance optimizations, as we have no title running. But it's always good to enable it if you're just experimenting and you're not getting your desired FPS. So if you're getting like 50 to 60 FPS, then don't enable it. But if you're getting lower performance, then it's an experimental feature, so maybe try to enable it. Dump video, so if you want everything that's being rendered to dump into a video, you can choose this option. And then help, we have check for updates, FAQ, and about CITRA, so all good there. Now we're just going to go into configure and see what are we working with. So first up we have general section, and in general section we have confirm exit while emulation is running. Okay, so whenever we try to exit it, it's gonna give us a prompt that are you sure. Pause emulation when in the background, you can check it if you want. If you're doing multitasking and you want your gameplay to be paused every time you switch a tab, so that's up to you. Hide motion and inactivity, pretty self-explanatory. Check for updates on start, silently auto update after closing. So if you want to close the emulator, do something, go about your day, and then come back and have your emulator already updated for you, you can check this option. And then region we have auto select, we're going to keep it auto select. Emulation speed is 100%. So for some reason, let's say it's never been that case, but let's say you have a really long cutscene and for some reason you can't just skip it, then you will just increase your emulation speed, so it will go way faster, and then you can adjust it back to 100%. So it's just in those type of scenarios where you can't really progress the gameplay and you just wanna like move it right along. And emulation speed, that's done, and then use alternate speed. So if you want to, instead of using this speed, you want to specify some alternate speed, that's up to you. But we're not going to go into that. So these are very niche features and they're not that performance optimized. So it's just depends on the scenario. So if you come across that, then you can use them. And in web we have token. So if you are a Patreon supporter, you can paste a token in here, and then you get access to the Patreon only builds, and then you can get access to experimental features and a lot of features that the team have planned, but they're not rolled out to public yet, but you can try them out because you're a Patreon supporter. And in debug we have debug. We're not going to go into that. UI, here are different UI options if you want to change theme, color, or anything like that, font. If this is something up your alley, then by all means give it a shot. And in system we have enabled new 3ds mode. So this is the mode that was in the console. So if you remember that we have two screens, and then we got an option for 3ds mode, so it's basically trying to emulate that. So just enable that, just for the sake of the accuracy of the emulation. Then we have all these profiles and CPU clock speed. Now bear in mind that this can improve your performance sometimes, but it is CPU dependent. Okay, so if your CPU supports it, if it supports higher frequencies, then you might want to adjust it to 110, 120. Don't go crazy because your game is going to crash, but it's always worth a shot to just increase it slightly. And it's also an experimental feature again. So if you have a really low end PC and somewhat competent graphics card, then you might be able to increase it a little, but just try it on each game basis so that you'll know that whether this feature works with your game or not, because every game is different and its implementation is different, not to mention different CPU vendors and models. And then in camera we have all these, so I don't know who uses the camera with 3ds. I don't know, but the feature is there if you need it. And in graphics we have enhancements. Then internal resolution we have native, the native resolution of a 3ds console. I guess it's okay, but I think our build is a lot more capable than this. So you can select 2x native or 3x native. I would go with 3x native with the mid-end PC. So if you have a really low-end PC, just use 2x native or native. But if you have a mid-end PC, then you can go with 3x native or even 4x native. So that's going to give you higher resolution. And then linear filtering, so it's a filtering mechanism. This makes your rendering a little bit smoother. And post-processing shadow is none. Of course, it's none. We're not going to mess with that. Texture filter, if your PC supports it, just use bicubic, which is the best implementation in any of the emulator. These are some other implementations, and if you have a really high-end graphics card, you can actually use some of them. But I would always, even if I have a high-end PC, I would always go with bicubic because I like the filtering technique. It's very subtle and it makes a big difference. But if you have a low-end PC, just use it just like none. And in stereoscopy, then we have stereoscopic 3D mode. So how do you want the 3D mode? In 3ds console, it was just down. So it was the downwards facing screen, but here you can use any of those. And I guess if you have a 3D enabled display, I don't think many people do, but if you do, then you can go crazy with this. This option can really come in handy. And depth is 0%. We're not gonna go with depth, but you can actually adjust depth depending on the effects of the game, how realistic or how deep, I guess, you want the game effects to be. Then we have layout, which is pretty self-explanatory. And in advanced, we have hardware renderer. Always enable that, low and hard, and doesn't matter. Enable shader. So these are the ones that were always going to be enabled, except for this last one, because VSync is a technique that's used to prevent screen tearing. So if you don't have any screen tear effects, please don't enable that, as it can take a toll on your performance. So I just keep it disabled even if I have screen tearing, because I want that extra FPS. But if your PC can support it, by all means enable it. And in audio we have HLE fast. We're gonna select HLE high level emulation, which is the fastest and best option. That's why I selected by default. You can actually select LLE, but these are the recompiler option, so sometimes it can introduce a little bit of stuttering, but it can be a good idea if you have really high frequencies and you are also multi-core, so you can just try this one. But I guess it's also title dependent, so some of the titles might have some audio problems, and then you might benefit from changing this plugin. And then output engine is auto, of course. Audio stretching input type, so if you want your headphones in here, then you can select those, I guess. And then controls are pretty self-explanatory. Then you can also use different profiles for your controls, for different games, for different titles, new, and then you can rename it, and then you can load it from here, drop down menu. And you can also select the sensitivity from here, use these shoulder buttons right here, and I think that's all of our options. So there we have it, guys. That's pretty much everything that you need to know about CITRA Nightly. Now let's just try to launch CITRA Canary. And let's see if we can find some of the different options, if we have them in here. So far I can't see any of those options, and the reason is because most of the optimizations are underneath the hood, so you're not necessarily are going to see them, but when you launch a title it can make a difference. So for title, you can just dump your cartridges in your computer, and by using that specific method, it's gonna have a specific extension that you can load from just here, and everything else is pretty much the same. And now I'm gonna tell you guys the recommended specifications for low-end PC. So I would use enable frame advancing, but again, this is an experimental feature, so please be wary of that. I would go into configure, and these are okay. You can select it a little bit, so I would use 115% because I don't want to push it too much, then it's just gonna introduce bugs and just wreck chaos on all over my game. Enable 3ds, yep. And in graphics I would just use native. Now bear in mind these are for really low end PCs because this is a really low resolution, so I think it's guaranteed to give you FPS. Now I would select none in texture filter because I want to put just minimum load on it. And then audio is like this, and there you have it. That's the recommended specification for low-end PCs. Now mid-end or high-end PCs, what I would do is I would disable frame advancing. Again, this is an experimental feature and depends on your title, so your title might have some starvation problems, and frame advance could help with that. So it's always a good idea to run the title first, enable the option, and then try disabling and then see what difference does it make. So we go again into the graphics. Actually for system, adjust it to 100% because we want it to be as native as possible. And in graphics we would use 3x or 4x depending on your graphics. Enable linear filtering. Texture filtering I would use bicubic, and within advanced I would use VSync, just to give us a little bit of oomph in regards to the accuracy. So there you have it, guys. That was our look into CITRA, the whole emulator and the whole shebang. So hopefully you found this useful, and hopefully you'll be able to run your titles without any hitches. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial. Thank you so much for watching. Catch you guys later.